Hello all you ghouls and goblins, welcome back to Coffin of Dirt. You ready for tonight's story? Before I get started, if you aren't subscribing, please do so. Thanks. This is the story of Elizabeth Báthory, a Hungarian noblewoman of the 15th century. The Bathory family was one of the richest families in Europe at the time. The House of Bathory was founded by Elizabeth Báthory of the Countess clan. The Countess clan was an older, noble family in the Kingdom of Hungary. The House of Bathory is basically an offshoot of the original Countess clan. The Countess clan created its wealth primarily through rewards from King Ladislaus of Hungary. In medieval Hungary, most of Europe, kings like Ladislaus didn't usually pay soldiers with money. Instead, they would give them land, titles, and control over peasants. Basically, if they served the king well, they were given control over a region and the ability to profit from it. The Countess clan got these rewards through military service, like fighting wars for the king, suppressing rebellions, and defending borders. Imagine if we rewarded soldiers and veterans like this today. Like if you sign up to serve your country, the government gives you an acre of property. Low-key, that would be some serious incentive. Not trying to give the government any ideas, but just saying. Some things never really changed because back then, power didn't mean just having money. It was basically a get-out-of-jail-free card. Medieval nobles could basically do whatever they wanted. Elizabeth was born on August 7th, 1560, into the Bathory family. By this time, the Bathory family already had a reputation for being violent, cruel, and devious. They were even rumored to be involved in the occult. On top of that, Elizabeth's parents were first cousins. In fact, most of her family and other noble families were inbred. This was common amongst medieval nobility. Because marriage was used to keep land, wealth, and alliances within a very tight network. Obviously, this comes with consequences. Usually, children of incest have serious health conditions, like seizures, epilepsy, cognitive impairments, behavior issues, physical deformities, weak immune systems, and so on. Elizabeth struggled growing up. As a toddler, she fell into fits. She would grind her teeth loudly and clench her hands so hard her nails would pierce her palms of her hand until they bled. We now know this to be epilepsy, but back then they called it falling sickness. To Elizabeth's family, it was a curse or bad omen. It is important to note that during this time, the Bathory family was deeply involved with the Catholic Church, so for them to believe this was some sort of demonic possession was not a huge stretch. The treatments for falling sickness included religious rituals, superstitions, and herbal medicine. Because they often thought it was some sort of demonic possession or punishment from God, they would get members of the clergy to pray at bedside, and sometimes even perform exorcisms. Another treatment they used was rubbing an ointment made from bone and blood matter from a healthy person onto the body of the sick person. In Elizabeth's story, the treatment was repulsive. It was reported that after an episode, doctors would come into Elizabeth's chambers and rub an ointment on her lips. It has been said that for Elizabeth, the ointment's ingredients, blood and bone, were collected specifically from other little girls who were not sick. Let me paint you a picture. The doctor would come into Elizabeth's chambers as she sat in her feather bed adorned with a canopy of silk curtains. He would bring his unwashed, bare hand to Elizabeth's mouth and smear the paste onto her lips. Then, Elizabeth would sit still for anywhere up to 2 hours or more. The paste would harden and crack, and if she moved the wrong way, particles would flake off and enter her mouth. The taste of blood and bone dust was like chalky iron. It tasted like melted metal coins and wood shavings. So already you can see the kind of environment that Elizabeth is growing up in. And if the rumors are true, and Elizabeth's doctor is rubbing little girls' bones on her lips, then she was probably raised with the understanding that her bones and blood required lesser girls' bones and blood to stay strong and healthy, not the ideal setup for raising a functional member of society. As Elizabeth grows, her childhood years saw violence, loss, and instability. In addition to this gross medical experience, Elizabeth was exposed to constant violence. Her family had a reputation for not being easy to work for. Servants were regularly beaten, and executions were called for often. Some accounts even claim that her family trained her to be cruel. One documented event was when she was only 6 and she stood front row at a public execution. The story's a little gross and involves animals, so maybe you can skip it if you're squeamish. Elizabeth's governess led little Elizabeth by hand into a chattering and excited crowd. Men, women, and other children gathered for the event. Elizabeth reaches the front of the crowd, just steps away from the executioner's platform. About 3.5 feet off the ground is the platform, with cobblestone steps up to the top, where the ground is stained with dried blood, dirt, and whatever else happens to stone when blood and guts have seeped into it. A large set of wooden medieval doors behind the platform swings open. A prisoner is rushed out and pushed onto the platform. Arms flailing to catch his fall, he stumbles to all fours, weak, heaving, and in a daze. The crowd goes silent, and the show begins. 2 armed men grab the man from the ground, yanking him up by his bony arms. His frail body bears witness to the length of his imprisonment. All 3 men look to the left of the platform, where 2 more men wheel a squeaky cart up to the platform's edge. A horse corpse is in the wheelbarrow. They dump the horse's body onto the stage in front of the prisoner. The crowd remains still. All 4 men begin to bind the prisoner's arms and legs, the rope wrapped around his frail bones, creating friction burns as they scrape across his thin skin. Once he is bound and unable to move, they walk over and slice the horse directly down the middle. All the intestines and organs spill out in front of the crowd. The men dug out the contents of the horse's stomach. They then took the prisoner and shoved his entire body inside and sewed him in. Leaving only his head exposed. Once the man was all sewn up, he and the horse corpse were dragged away. The 2 main executioners took a bow and the crowd went nuts. The men are grunting and snorting like pigs about to chow down on some fresh slop, and the women cackle and holler like witches at a black mass. Life for Elizabeth pretty much stays on a grim trajectory. By the time Elizabeth turns 10, both her mother and dad are dead. They die one after the other. There is no exact record of her parents' cause of death. However, it is speculated that it was most likely of natural illness. Left orphaned, she was sent to live with some very distant relatives. Lucky for them, because gaining a Bathory child was like gaining a golden goose. It didn't take long for her to marry either. By 13, she was engaged. Obviously, the trauma that Elizabeth had endured by the time she was a teenager was extensive. We can only assume that was probably somewhat normal for a noble girl of her age during that time. Now, with all the information we have, we can speculate that this type of trauma would lead to some serious developmental and long-term issues. In modern terms, the combination of witnessing violence, medical trauma, and major loss would likely lead to PTSD, hypervigilance, emotional detachment, and dysregulation. Elizabeth was promised to Count Ferenc Nadezhdy when she was only 13 years old. Count Nadezhdy was 20 years old at the time of their marriage, and at the time he was already gaining quite the reputation for himself as a ruthless soldier. At 15 she married him, becoming the Countess, and went to live with his family, where she was cared for by her new mother-in-law, which was customary at the time for a noble heiress. Count Ferenc Nadezhdy wasn't just a regular nobleman, he was known and celebrated as the Black Knight of Hungary. He was known for his extreme bravery against the Ottoman Turks. Contemporary accounts stressed his extreme brutality, saying his tactics in war terrified his enemies and shocked his allies. During the first several years of their marriage, when the Count was away fighting, Elizabeth ran their estates. The Count had amassed huge amounts of wealth, estates, castles. You name it, they had it. When the Count was in battle, he showed zero mercy. According to some accounts, he was known to dance with the corpses of his enemies and play football with their severed heads. Later legend amplified his reputation. One story claims he tortured captives similar to the Wallachian prince Vlad the Impaler by impaling his enemies on stakes. Though historians treat such stories with skepticism, they do reflect that impalement and public mutilation were known punishments for the time. During times of peace, Elizabeth and the Count bonded over cruelty. He taught her torture methods that included honey and iron claws. Accounts say that he reportedly had servant girls smeared with honey and left to be bitten and eaten alive by insects. One account says that he gave Elizabeth spiked iron gloves to maim servants with. The two of them enjoyed watching and inflicting pain. Reports suggest that Elizabeth may have had an affair with a teenage peasant boy, which allegedly resulted in a pregnancy. According to these reports, Count Nadezhdy is said to have punished the boy by castrating him and then releasing hunting dogs that ultimately killed him. Elizabeth secretly gave birth to the infant, who was then given away to a trusted peasant couple in Wallachia. Elizabeth and the Count had 5 known children, 3 daughters and 2 sons. Their eldest daughter, Anna, was born 1585. married Nicholas Zrinski, a Croatian-Hungarian noble. Their daughters, Ursulia and Katalin, also made advantageous noble marriages. The first son, Andras, survived infancy but died young, around 6 or 7 years old. Only their son Paul lived to an old age. He became the father of Franz Nadestade III, a noted conspirator in plots against Habsburg authority during the turbulent political struggles of the 17th century Hungary. The Count became permanently paralyzed around 1601 after suffering from a mysterious illness. Records say he suffered from a disease of the lower limbs, but there are several conditions he could have had that would have led to paralysis. For example, late-stage syphilis, a common disease at the time, can cause progressive neurological damage and paralysis. Other possibilities include severe gout or stroke complications, but these are a little less consistent with a 2-year disease of the legs. In 1604, the Count died at the age of 48, ending their 29-year marriage. But even after the Count's death, Elizabeth's cruelty would escalate. According to trial testimony, she used a wide array of torture methods. In addition to the techniques I mentioned before, she also began plunging victims into icy water until they froze. She would starve them in dungeon cells. She would burn and whip prisoners, poke them with red-hot irons and sharp needles, even under their fingernails. She gouged and cut flesh and sometimes amputated body parts. She even took to biting into her victims' faces and limbs. But the most widely circulated element of her legend claims that she bathed in the blood of virgin girls in an attempt to preserve her youth. In the 16th to 17th century Hungary, torture methods were extremely brutal by modern standards, but were widely used in warfare and criminal punishment. Practices such as impalement, flaying, burning, mutilation, and even exposure to freezing conditions were recorded as common methods used by both Hungarian and Ottoman forces during conflicts. During Elizabeth's trial, one witness claimed that her daughter Katalin, often called Kata, helped her mother by luring victims and was present at a torture session just before her wedding. The account says that Kata helped torment victims so savagely that both girls were burned alive during the wedding celebration. However, beyond this, there is no evidence that she was involved, and she was never prosecuted or forced to testify. In 1610, King Matthias II ordered an investigation into Elizabeth's activities. Count George Churzo uncovered evidence of her alleged crimes, leading to the arrest of Bathory and several accomplices. 3 of the accomplices were servants in her household. Their names were Dorotea Sentas, Ilona Jew, and Janos Ujavari. All 3 were found guilty of participating in torture and were executed. The courts concluded that they weren't passive witnesses and that they were actively involved in the violence. Dorotea and Ilona were tortured before being burned alive, while Janos was beheaded. Just a note, isn't that lovely how the women get tortured and burned alive and the man gets a quick and easy death, like getting his head chopped? Okay, back to our program. The 4th accomplice was a woman named Katalin Banitsky. She provided testimony and report about the alleged abuses. In the trial, it is reported that they were not close friends or family and are considered part of a politically and socially complex investigation, where noble rivalries and land interests may have influenced accusations. Katalin was not executed, but was sentenced to life imprisonment. 2 other women served as great influences on Countess Elizabeth that you may or may not have heard of. The first one is Anna Darvulia. She worked in Elizabeth's household when she was just a young girl. She is often described as a nurse, governess, or a tutor figure. Some accounts suggest she played a role in shaping how Elizabeth understood discipline, fear, and may have influenced her exposure in occult ideas. Her portrayal in the media is largely fictionalized. She is often reimagined as a herbalist, a lesbian, and sometimes even a romantic partner to Elizabeth. During the time of the Bathory case, the early 17th century was one of the most intense periods for the witch hunts. Across Hungary and much of the continent, accusations of witchcraft were becoming increasingly common. One of the most well-known figures connected to this atmosphere was a village woman named Erzy Marchova. I think I said that right. She was accused of helping Elizabeth Báthory through magic. Specifically, there were claims that she tried to use witchcraft to curse the king on Bathory's behalf. She was later burned at the stake for those accusations. Even though Elizabeth Báthory herself was surrounded by these accusations, her official investigation was actually led by her uncle, Palatine George Churzo. And interesting, he did not include witchcraft as part of the initial suspicion. But when the case was formally built, she was not actually tried or convicted for witchcraft. Her charges were focused on something much more grounded in the evidence at the time: murder and torture. This is important because the timing of her case matters a lot. Investigation happens right as Europe is sliding deeper and deeper into religious paranoia. The early stages of the 30 Years' War were beginning, and if you don't know, the 30 Years' War was a devastating conflict across Central Europe driven by religious division and political rivalry, which began in the Holy Roman Empire and ended by reshaping the balance of power in Europe. Hence, the fear of witches, heresy, and conspiracies were spreading so rapidly. Hungary itself was also unstable. It was a region caught between empires, religious conflict, and basically constant political tension. When the investigation into Elizabeth began, investigators gathered a huge amount of witness testimonies. In total, there was around 300 depositions that were collected from people in the surrounding areas. These included her own servants, staff, as well as local villagers. It may sound like a massive amount of evidence, but most of these statements were not first-hand accounts. It was a lot of hearsay, rumors, and gossip, and a significant amount were given under extreme pressure. Under interrogation, some servants claimed that between 30 and 50 people had been killed. None of these numbers was based on documented records, but was reconstructed through pressure testimony. The case becomes difficult to define because depending on which testimony you focus on, the Countess is either a calculated serial killer or a figure shaped by fear and pressure. But the court still had to decide what version they believed, and Elizabeth Countess Bathory was confined to her castle until her death in 1614. In more recent decades, historians and archaeologists have gone back to Castle Countess, hopefully I said that right, to excavate the ground. And they did in fact discover human remains. Dozens of skeletons were found around the castle, including graves that weren't clearly marked. It may be starting to sound like this supports the idea of mass killings, but historians are still cautious with that interpretation because these remains could have been from many different sources. Family burials from earlier generations, victims of plague or disease outbreaks, soldiers killed, or even people who had to be buried quickly during war times. It is not uncommon for castle grounds to have people buried. Finding 30 to 50 skeletons around a huge, old castle isn't unusual, so archaeologists would emphasize that bones alone won't tell you who caused the deaths or why they were buried there. Which brings us to the major debate and blows the doors wide open for the Blood Countess. Motivation. One theory suggests she was killing people for financial gain, like she was shaking down villagers for money, like some sort of Hungarian mob boss. But again, historians aren't really supporting this theory. Elizabeth was already one of the wealthiest women in the area, so why would she need to kill poor villagers for cash? This argument doesn't really hold up. Most of the alleged victims were poor girls and lower status individuals, people who realistically wouldn't have the resources to provide any meaningful ransom. Instead, modern historians tend to look at this case through politics and power. Elizabeth was in a powerful position, and that made her a target. And when you follow the money, King Matthias II owed the Bathorys a large debt. And when she was ultimately confined, guess whose debt was cancelled? Yeah. So the crown indirectly benefited from her downfall. And there were also political gains as well. Georgi Turzo, the Palatine, Georgi Turzo, who led the investigation, also Elizabeth's uncle, increased his influence significantly after bringing down one of the most powerful noble figures in the region. Depending on how you look at it, you either see a blood-crazed noblewoman, or you see a powerful political figure removed in a way that benefited multiple factions at the top of society. And the truth obviously depends heavily on which version you believe. After the Countess was arrested and confined, her story did not end in the courtroom. In a lot of ways, the second version or sequel began to spread. At the time of her trial, official charges were actually very specific. They focused on testimony, alleged torture, and servant statements. But outside the legal record, when the rumors started to swirl, pamphlets, rumors, secondhand accounts began to spread across Europe. And with every retelling, the story became less like a legal case and more like a horror story. One of the most famous additions was the idea that she bathed in the blood of young girls, supposedly to preserve her youth. But this detail does not appear in the original trial records. It shows up in folklore and dramatized retellings. The other layer that gets added is the idea of mechanical torture devices like the infamous Iron Maiden, which, if you don't know, is a coffin-shaped box with spikes on the inside, supposedly used to impale a victim when it is closed. Many more additions appear in later retellings. So what you end up with is two versions of the Countess Elizabeth Báthory. One is built from court testimonies and legal documents, and the other is built from folklore and centuries of retellings, which slowly merge into a single figure, the Blood Countess. So what do you believe? Do you think she was framed by her uncle and the king? Or do you think she was a full-on, blood-bathing, iron-claw-maiming, sadistic freak? Or do you think two things can be true and both happened? But either way, that's it for today's video. Hit that subscribe if you haven't already, and comment below what hellish history, fucked up folklore, and mysterious monster you want me to drag into the light next. New videos every Tuesday and Thursday. Maybe more if I feel like it. But until then, keep your doors locked, candles lit, and mind open. Sweet screams.